This was a puzzle that baffled police. 2 men and 1 woman walked into a sealed room, apartment 1601. 90 minutes later, 1 man was dead, stabbed 11 times. Logically, a case like this shouldn't be complicated. One of the other 2 had to be the killer. But what made it a headache for police was that both survivors insisted they had blacked out and remembered nothing. To make matters worse, the crime scene was the couple's own apartment, so it was already covered in their fingerprints and DNA, rendering most physical evidence useless. And so what should have been a straightforward murder case turned into an absurd farce where nobody remembered killing anyone. Faced with this bizarre and puzzling case, can you, with your sharp mind, cut through the fog and identify the real killer? Let's travel back to 2013 and step into that mysterious apartment, 1601. Silver Spring is located in the heart of Maryland, one of Montgomery County's busiest urban centers. It sits just north of Washington, D.C.'s border, with convenient transportation and a vibrant mix of cultures and urban energy, whether it is Asian restaurants, Latin American street food, or various music and art festivals. The city is full of lively character. In 2024, it was named one of America's best places to live by Fortune magazine, and our story today takes place right here. At 3:25 a.m. on the 13th of October, 2013, the Montgomery County Police Department's phone rang. The dispatcher picked up, and on the other end was a woman's voice, slurred.
What do you need the police for?
My friend is, he's here and I need emergency right now.
Okay, what is going on that you need the police? What is happening?
I don't know.
Usually, when people call 911, they're panicked and urgent because of an emergency. But this time, the woman on the phone was clearly drunk. She couldn't even explain why she was calling or what she needed police to do. After several minutes of patient communication, officers finally pieced together the situation. A friend of hers was lying in a pool of blood in critical condition. Police immediately dispatched 2 officers to the scene. Apartment 1601, 1220 East, West Highway, Silver Spring, Maryland at 3:36 a.m. Officers arrived at the door of apartment 1601. When the door swung open, they were met with a scene straight out of a horror movie. The apartment reeked of alcohol and blood, with things scattered everywhere, and blood splattered across the walls and carpet. A young woman sat at the entrance. She was the caller. She had some blood on her and was clearly intoxicated. When officers asked what had happened, she said she had no idea. Officers restrained her outside and entered the apartment to investigate. The apartment was small. To the left of the entrance was the kitchen, to the right the bathroom, and beyond that an open living room and bedroom. On the carpet beside the bed, they found 2 men lying in pools of blood. The man on the right side of the bed had bled through the carpet. His blood was still spreading, and he had no pulse. The man by the head of the bed, though covered in blood, had no visible injuries. It looked like he had just passed out drunk, occasionally mumbling in his sleep. Officers woke him up and asked what had happened. He said, in anguish, "My girlfriend and my buddy were hooking up, and I caught them, so I killed him." The police thought he just confessed. If so, the case would be easy. The man was then taken into custody. While waiting for the coroner and more officers to arrive, police identified the 3 people in the apartment and their relationships. The woman who called 911 was Taylor. The surviving man covered in blood was her boyfriend, Rahul. The apartment was rented by the couple. The victim was their mutual friend, Mark. All 3 were highly educated young adults. They had been drinking at bars earlier and returned to the apartment at 1:50 a.m., just over an hour before the bloodshed. As soon as officers had that information, additional units arrived and conducted a more thorough examination. The victim, Mark, had 11 stab wounds, 6 of which were deep puncture wounds to his neck, chest, arms, and back. The other 5 were superficial cuts concentrated on his fingers and arms, clearly defensive wounds from a desperate struggle. The cause of death was exsanguination from the stab wounds. The murder weapon, an 8-inch kitchen knife, was found under his leg. The doors and windows were intact, and hallway surveillance showed that no one other than the 3 had entered or left that night, meaning the killer had to be either Rahul or Taylor. On the surface, Rahul had already confessed, so the case seemed clear, but the problem was that both of them were covered in blood. Both were heavily intoxicated, and both were incoherent. How much of what they said could be trusted? So police decided to take both of them to headquarters for further interrogation. At the same time, they began a thorough investigation into the backgrounds of the three young people and their activities that night. Rahul came from an Indian immigrant family. His parents had moved to the United States from India in 1986 and ran a printing business in McLean, Virginia. After years of hard work, they had built a solid middle-class foundation for the family. They believed in hard work and placed great emphasis on education. They hoped Rahul would become a doctor, a teacher, or pursue some other respectable profession. Rahul lived up to their expectations. He excelled academically from a young age and was considered a bright student by teachers and peers. During his time at Langley High School, Rahul became close friends with Mark. Mark was outgoing and cheerful, always smiling. He was the class clown. He was also an excellent public speaker, a key member of the school's debate team that won many competitions. Beyond his verbal skills, he was also highly capable, a standout in the Boy Scouts who earned the prestigious Eagle Scout rank. He had even saved a classmate's life in an accident, demonstrating remarkable responsibility and courage. The two formed a deep friendship in high school. After graduation, they went their separate ways for college. Mark attended James Madison University, graduating with honors, and was accepted into Georgetown University Law Center for graduate school. Teachers and classmates spoke highly of him, calling him a man of both intelligence and charisma with limitless potential. Rahul, meanwhile, attended George Washington University, majoring in biomedical engineering, following the path his parents hoped would lead to medical school. In college, Rahul met Taylor, a beautiful girl in his major. Taylor was an outstanding student, often praised by her professors. Although they had known each other for some time, they didn't start dating until their senior year, and their relationship developed steadily. After graduation, Taylor chose not to pursue further studies, but instead went to work for the Food and Drug Administration, a solid career move. Rahul continued at GU for his master's degree, focusing on nanomedicine and tissue engineering. He was passionate about his research and often spoke enthusiastically about his projects. In the eyes of his professors and peers, he was intelligent, hardworking, and not prone to arguments. The apartment where the crime occurred, 1601, was rented by Taylor. In February 2013, Rahul moved in, since Taylor had a job and income while Rahul was still a student. She covered the rent and most living expenses. Because Rahul's GU campus and Mark's Georgetown Law campus were close by, the three saw each other frequently, often hanging out, partying, and traveling together. They were very close. All three were bright, accomplished young people with promising futures. But no one could have predicted that a bloody murder would bring everything to a sudden halt. The 12th of October 2013 was Rahul's 24th birthday. He and Taylor decided to celebrate with a romantic evening and went to a restaurant near DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. After a candlelit dinner, they weren't ready to call it a night, so they headed to a nearby bar for drinks. Coincidentally, they ran into Mark and Rahul's college classmate White. The four of them hung out together, chatting and having a good time. An hour passed, and they moved to another bar to keep the night going. At some point, Rahul and White stepped outside to smoke marijuana, leaving Taylor and Mark inside, drinking and chatting. During that time, something ambiguous happened. Taylor later claimed that White had been texting her flirtatiously, trying to hit on her. But White told a different story. He said he noticed Taylor and Mark getting too close and acting flirtatiously, so he approached Taylor and told her, "You shouldn't be doing that." Taylor immediately denied it, saying, "How could you think that? I love my boyfriend. I would never do anything behind his back." Mark happened to walk over just then and caught only the last part, "I would never do anything behind his back," and assumed White was hitting on Taylor. He got angry, and the atmosphere became tense. They moved to a third bar, and Mark decided to confront the issue directly, telling Rahul that White had made a move on Taylor that made things extremely awkward. White, seeing that everyone had been drinking and wanting to avoid a conflict, didn't try to explain. He just left early. The night ended on a sour note. Of course, these were the conflicting accounts from White and Taylor. We'll never know the full truth, But what happened next was objective fact. After the night ended, Mark went back to Rahul and Taylor's apartment at 1601. At 1:50 a.m., surveillance captured the three entering the building's elevator. They were smiling with lingering intoxication, and the mood seemed harmonious, with no signs of conflict. Once inside the apartment, they continued drinking vodka and smoking marijuana, then lounged on the sofa playing games. Since there was no surveillance inside the apartment, no one could say exactly how much they drank. But just over an hour after they got back, Taylor called 911, and we saw the scene at the beginning of our story, when the two were first brought to the police station. Before formal questioning even began, Rahul suddenly broke down and said, "I screwed up. He tried to stab me. He is a jerk. He tried to hurt my family." It sounded like he was justifying his actions, consistent with his earlier confession at the apartment. But when the actual interrogation began, the story took a turn. At 8:10 a.m., Rahul was brought into the interrogation room. Perhaps sobering up, he recanted, denying his earlier confession, saying he had drunk too much and smoked marijuana. His mind was a blur, and he didn't remember anything that had happened. He even demanded the interrogation be ended, saying he was hungry and tired and needed to eat and sleep, repeatedly insisting he wanted a lawyer. After 55 minutes of questioning, police had gotten almost nothing, so they turned their attention to Taylor. But Taylor was even more frustrating. She claimed ignorance of everything, insisting over and over, "I don't know what happened. I have no idea what happened." No matter how police pressed her, she maintained she had been so drunk, she remembered nothing. When the interrogator told her that Rahul said he had seen her and Mark in bed together, her expression and reaction didn't seem like an act. But police didn't let her off the hook. After all, Rahul had said a key phrase in his initial confession.
I found out that Taylor and Mark may have been going out or something behind my back.
So the interrogator asked directly,
"Were you in bed with Mark at all
not.
during the night?"
No.
Although Taylor denied it repeatedly, she added a revealing comment.
If you find evidence otherwise, I'm not going to deny it.
To be some ambiguity between her and Mark. The interrogator pressed further. Normally,
Did you kill Mark?
a suspect would answer with a firm no, like Rahul had. But Taylor's response was that she had no reason and no strength to kill Mark. She said she didn't think she was the killer because she genuinely had been too drunk to remember anything. She could only analyze and conclude that way. Police carefully analyzed and compared her performance on the 911 call, her statements to officers at the apartment, and her testimony during interrogation. They found her account consistent and without contradictions, matching typical signs of intoxication. In other words, Taylor didn't appear to be lying. But a closer examination of physical evidence revealed some suspicious points. Elevator surveillance showed that Taylor had been wearing a red dress when she returned from the bar, but when the first officers arrived, she was wearing a gray t-shirt and pink shorts. Officers had even photographed her, and another set of clothes, a white t-shirt, was found in the room. Clearly, in just over an hour, she had changed twice, and both sets of discarded clothes had bloodstains. Police suspected she had cleaned up the scene. Taylor explained that she might have come into contact with Mark or Rahul during the chaos, which is how she got blood on her. But she genuinely didn't know what had happened. As for why she changed clothes, she couldn't explain. In the 911 call, Rahul had said, "Don't touch me," suggesting Taylor had tried to touch them. Her explanation was plausible, and the first responding officer also testified that Taylor's hair was dry and she was still wearing makeup. Clearly, she hadn't washed her face or showered, which would have been necessary to deliberately remove bloodstains. This suggested she didn't have much blood on her, and since the victim Mark had been stabbed 11 times at close range, the killer would inevitably have been covered in blood. All this indicated that Taylor was unlikely to be the one who directly committed the murder. So was Rahul the killer? By now, police had formed a clear judgment. The three had been in a small, almost completely open apartment, and the victim had been stabbed 11 times. The coroner's report indicated he had put up a fierce struggle. In theory, such a violent commotion could not have gone unnoticed by Rahul and Taylor. Yet both kept insisting they had no memory of that night. What made it even harder for police was that apartment 1601 was Taylor and Rahul's residence. So any physical evidence found inside, such as fingerprints, blood, or the knife, could not be used as conclusive proof. With both of them claiming total amnesia, the investigation was at a standstill. To break the deadlock, police decided to take a risky approach. Let Rahul and Taylor meet face to face to see if they would confront each other and reveal something. Under police arrangement, they were allowed to meet in the interrogation room. Of course, even though police weren't in the room, both knew they were being monitored. When they met, Rahul struck first,
Did you stab Mark or no?
repeating his story, insisting he hadn't killed Mark, and then telling Taylor to leave so he could call his lawyer. Just when it seemed the strategy of confrontation had failed, Rahul suddenly changed his story, saying Taylor was the one who killed Mark, and again emphasizing that he didn't know anything. This turn of events caught police's attention. They had suspected from the start that the two had conspired before officers arrived, forming a united front of silence. Now, in an attempt to save himself, Rahul was pointing the finger at his girlfriend. The alliance had crumbled, and the truth was about to come out. Police relayed Rahul's betrayal to Taylor to see how she would react. To their surprise, Taylor just put her hand on her forehead. She didn't turn on Rahul. At this point, from the 9/11 call through the entire interrogation, Taylor's story had remained consistent throughout. Rahul, on the other hand, had flip-flop repeatedly, first confessing, then denying, then blaming his girlfriend. By comparison, who looked more guilty was obvious. When it became clear that confessions wouldn't break the case, police turned to White, the fourth person from that night. White told police that he had noticed Taylor and Mark acting flirtatiously and warned her to be careful. But when Mark misunderstood and thought White was hitting on Taylor, things got awkward. Because everyone had been drinking, White didn't force an explanation. He just left early to avoid further conflict. White also said bluntly, "I don't trust Taylor, she is lying." Although his testimony didn't directly point to the killer, combined with Rahul's initial confession, "My girlfriend and my buddy were hooking up," and Taylor's remark that if there were evidence, I wouldn't deny it, police gradually pieced together a plausible scenario. That night, after drinking, Taylor and Mark may have had some ambiguous moment. Rahul caught them, and under the influence of alcohol, marijuana, and rage, he completely lost control and stabbed his best friend. At this point, police were convinced that Rahul was the killer. After the interrogation, Rahul was formally arrested and charged with Mark's murder. Taylor's statements had been consistent and matched the symptoms of intoxication. More importantly, regardless of whether there had been any romantic involvement between her and Mark, she lacked a clear motive, and police didn't have enough evidence to charge her. She was released. Once the case entered the judicial process, Rahul's parents immediately hired a top Fay-tier legal team. They were a middle Fay-class family in Virginia, and they would spare no expense to save their son's future. At the bail hearing, the judge ruled that Rahul had a pattern of lying and was a flight risk, so bail was set at a staggering $2 million. Moreover, as the prosecution's investigation deepened, the initial charge of second Fay-degree murder was upgraded to first Fay-degree murder. On the 2nd of March 2015, the long Fay-delayed trial finally began. The prosecution argued that the tragedy was clear. Rahul had overwhelming evidence against him. His motive was catching his girlfriend Taylor and his best friend Mark in an ambiguous situation, and in a fit of rage, he killed. The prosecution presented a series of evidence. First, when police arrived, Rahul had confessed on the spot. When brought to the station before formal questioning, he confessed again. After the interrogation, he called his father and said,
"What happened? Mark and I got into a fight and he tried to get a knife and then I grew a knife."
These three confessions were the most critical evidence. Second, Rahul was covered in far more blood than Taylor. His clothes were soaked in it. Given the ferocity of the attack on Mark, the killer would inevitably have been drenched in blood, which matched the evidence. The stab wounds on Mark's back were deep and required significant force, something Taylor was unlikely to possess. It had to be Rahul. Friends of Rahul said he had a decent temper normally, but became violent when drunk, consistent with a drunk Fay-driven killing. Most importantly, as Taylor herself had repeatedly emphasized, although she didn't know what happened that night, she was certain she had no reason to kill Mark. That was true. She lacked motive. Rahul's lawyers fought back. Their strategy wasn't just to clear Rahul, it was to pin the blame on Taylor. First, they argued that all three had been heavily intoxicated and had smoked marijuana, making memory loss normal. Rahul himself didn't remember anything, let alone have a clear memory of killing anyone. The large amount of blood on his body came from performing CPR on Mark. You couldn't determine the killer by who had more blood. Rahul himself said, "I was completely drunk, lying on the sofa. I only looked up when I heard Taylor scream. I saw Mark covered in blood, seriously injured. I tried to help stop the bleeding, hugged him, and then did CPR. That is how I got blood all over me. The defense also presented evidence, blonde hairs found on Mark's hands and in the bloodstains on the wall, though not tested, clearly belonging to Taylor. One of Taylor's contact lenses found on Mark's jeans, Taylor's broken fingernail, possibly sustained during the attack, and photos taken by police at the scene showed redness on Taylor's hands, especially on her knuckles, consistent with gripping a knife. In addition, Taylor had changed clothes twice, and both sets had bloodstains, indicating extensive contact with Mark, and the fact that she changed twice proved she was clear fade-headed. The defense also called an expert witness who testified that any adult could inflict the wounds on Mark's back, including Taylor. Finally, Rahul's family insisted he loved Taylor deeply and had intended to marry her. He would do anything for her, and his confession was actually to take the fall for his girlfriend. Based on this, the defense argued that Rahul was innocent, wrongly accused, and the real killer was Taylor. The defense even accused police of negligence. The murder weapon and the hairs at the scene were never sent for testing, and many pieces of evidence were compromised on the spot. The prosecution rebutted each point. The hairs, even if Taylor's meant nothing, it was her apartment, so her hair and fingerprints would be everywhere. The broken nail could have happened earlier, and the other half wasn't found on Mark. The contact lens was also meaningless. It could have been left in the apartment earlier and later stuck to Mark's pants. As for the claim that Rahul confessed to protect Taylor, police found evidence to the contrary. Their text messages showed relationship problems and sexual dissatisfaction, indicating their relationship had already soured. Rahul wouldn't have taken the fall for her, and his later flip-flopping proved it. In the end, the prosecution and defense clashed fiercely in court for 2 full weeks. The jury took only 4.5 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. Rahul was guilty of first-degree murder. Taylor, since she had never been charged, faced no legal consequences. On May 27, 2015, the judge formally sentenced Rahul to life in prison for the murder of Mark. In late 2016, Rahul appealed, claiming that there had been improper communication between the judge and the jury during the trial, violating procedural fairness, but the appeal was quickly denied and the original verdict upheld. With that, this bewildering case was finally settled. But for Rahul's family, they never truly accepted the outcome. They refused to believe their son was a killer. In their eyes, he was a smart, obedient young man who never caused trouble, certainly not a cold, faint-blooded murderer. They insisted Rahul had gone to prison to take the blame for Taylor. In fact, a small portion of the public shared that view. But police, through thorough investigation, had largely ruled out Taylor as the direct perpetrator, while acknowledging that she was not without fault. Police theorized that the tragedy may have been triggered by Taylor's ambiguous behavior with Mark, which enraged Rahul, and under the influence of alcohol and marijuana, he picked up the knife and stabbed his friend. In other words, she had indirectly caused the tragedy. Own more detail. Worth noting, on the night of the murder, Mark had sent several unusual texts to a friend at 2:01 a.m. My night is becoming unprecedented awkward at 2:19 a.m. I want to bite my fingers off so the ambulance takes me away, and I can get out of here at 2:55 a.m. Wake up, I need help. These messages make it clear that something was making Mark deeply uneasy in apartment 1601. Based on the overall case reconstruction, it is highly likely that Rahul caught Mark and Taylor in an ambiguous moment, then angrily confronted them. Why are you doing this? How long has it been going on? His girlfriend and his best friend had both betrayed him, and in a rage, he grabbed a kitchen knife. That is when Mark sent his final SOS text. Coincidentally, the neighbor also heard a loud crash around that time, likely the beginning of the violent struggle. Just 30 minutes later, Mark was dead. Taylor then called 911 at Rahul's request. Of course, all of this is speculation, since both Taylor and Rahul claim to remember nothing of that night. The truth of what happened may never be known. Looking back at this tragedy, what should have been an ordinary birthday celebration turned into bloodshed and death. 3 bright young people, a future doctor, a research scientist working at the FDA, and a promising legal star. All in the prime of their lives, ready to write their own chapters of success. But one night of drinking, an ambiguous moment, fueled by alcohol and marijuana, and in an instant, everything was gone, leaving behind this irreversible tragedy. That is the story for today. Please give us a like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world to me.